The Holy Gospel according to St. Luke, the 3rd chapter. Glory to you, Lord. As the people were filled with expectation, and all were questioning in their hearts concerning John, whether he might be the Messiah, John answered all of them by saying, I baptize you with water, but one who is more powerful than I is coming. I am not worthy to untie the thong of his sandals. He will baptize you with the Holy Spirit and fire. His winnowing fork is in his hand to clear his threshing floor and to gather the wheat into his granary. But the chaff he will burn with unquenchable fire. Now when all the people were baptized, and when Jesus also had been baptized and was praying, the heaven was opened, and the Holy Spirit descended upon him in bodily form like a dove. And a voice came from heaven, You are my Son, the Beloved. With you I am well pleased. The Gospel of the Lord. So in the first couple of weeks of pretty much any new year, many of us are starting to rethink our eating habits after having completely abandoned any form of restraint over the holiday season. So lots of us are thinking about how we can eat less, how we can eat better, and how we can maybe even hold on to a couple of those New Year's resolutions that say we're going to change our eating habits in this new year. And there is an old saying that many of us think about whenever we consider changing our eating habits. That's that old phrase that goes, you are what you eat, right? You are what you eat. And that would be a really scary thing if it were literally true at this time of year. Lots of us would be big globs of cookies and chocolate and eggnog and stuff like that. But on the other hand, we recognize that what we eat really is important for our health, for our stamina, and for the way that our bodies function. So we pay attention to what we eat and what kinds of things we eat. But there's a problem with that saying, you are what you eat, as well. And that's because whenever we say things like, you are what you eat, what you're actually doing is you're defining yourself, who you are, by what you do or by what you don't do. It's not even so much about the food itself, because the phrase is not something like, well, you know, your body is affected by the things you eat. Nor is it a phrase like, remember, if you only eat sugar, you're going to have a crash, and you're not going to have energy. The phrase is, you are what you eat, and so you're defining yourself by what you do or by what you don't do. And so often in our lives, we define ourselves by what we do or by what we don't do, and we don't really even notice it. And when we do that, even if it's just subconsciously, we start to define our actual self-worth by the stuff that we've done or not done, or maybe the stuff we tell ourselves that we would really have the potential to do if we just tried harder. So all too often, we fall into this trap of defining ourselves by what we do. It happens at this time of year when we sort of subconsciously at least measure our self-worth by whether we're able to hold on to our New Year's resolutions. Do we got the willpower to actually do it this year? And when we don't have the willpower, or at least the willpower that we wanted to, we start to wonder, who am I? Is this really me? We do it all the time in our schools and our workplaces, where, after all, our grades and our job performance evaluations are usually based upon what we've done, or what we've accomplished, or what we've not done and not accomplished. Sometimes we even fall into that trap in our own personal relationships, where we sit there and kind of kick ourselves and wonder, have I done enough to be a good friend, a good parent, a good spouse? I wonder if we fall into this trap all the time because, in some respects, it's easy to kind of add up all of our successes and our failures and measure ourselves in that way. But really, is that really who you are? Are you really the sum of your successes and failures? Aren't you more than that? In today's gospel reading, Jesus is being baptized as the beginning of his public ministry. And as Jesus begins his public ministry, it's important to note that at this point in the gospel story, Jesus has done absolutely nothing. He has not preached the good news to the poor. He has performed not a single miracle. And most importantly, he has not gone to the cross to take away the sins of the world. He's done absolutely nothing. And yet, the voice of God comes down from heaven and declares to Jesus, "You are my son, my beloved." God even says, "With you, I am well pleased." Jesus' identity, who he actually is proclaimed. He's God's son. He's loved. God is actually pleased with him right now, even before and apart from anything Jesus has done, not done, or has the potential to do. Jesus' identity was simply going to, if Jesus' identity was simply going to be defined by the sum of things that he did or didn't do, we would expect to hear the voice of God, maybe as Jesus drew his final breath on the cross, where as he's died for the sins of the world after having done all these other things, God says, "Ah, you are my beloved son. I'm so pleased with you. You've done everything just the way I had planned it." Or, if we heard the voice of Jesus at the baptism and it was based on what Jesus did or didn't do or had the potential to do, we would expect the voice of Jesus to say, "You are my son. Now, don't mess things up, because if you do, I'm going to think you're a rotten kid and disown you." That's the way it would be if Jesus' identity was based on what he did. But in Jesus' baptism, God gives him an identity and a promise that transcends anything Jesus has done or not done, or even has the potential to do. And indeed, because Jesus is secure in his identity as God's beloved child, he has the power and the courage to do all the things that we often remember most. He preaches good news to the poor, he shares God's love by performing all these miracles, and he dies and rises again for the sins of the whole world. Jesus' baptism makes clear that what you do doesn't make you who you are. Instead, you do what you do because of who you are. That sounds like kind of a very small difference, but it's an important one. And it's an important difference not just for Jesus, but for us as well. And that's because in our baptism, God has given us the same identity. God has claimed us as beloved children. God has promised his love to us. God has even told us that he's pleased with each one of us, not because of what we've done, but because of who God has made us. And in baptism, God declares that that never goes away, and that's not undone by anything that we do or we don't do. Yet so often, when we think about living as Christians, we sometimes get caught in this even subconscious way of thinking about our own value, our own worth to God in terms of what we've done or what we haven't done. Am I a good Christian because that means, have I loved God enough? Have I cared for people in need and shared God's love with my neighbors? Have I shared my faith by the way I've lived? And while all those are good and important things for us to do, that doesn't define who we are as God's people. That doesn't define our value to God. Instead, God tells us, "You are my beloved child. I claim you. I love you right now. Now, go and live in such a way that you're not worried about earning your identity anymore." That's what God calls us to do, just as God called Jesus to do that as well. The baptism of Jesus, in fact, invites us to consider our own baptisms. And like Jesus, to understand that living as God's children begins each day with who we are, who God has made us, not what we've accomplished or failed to accomplish. So what might that look like for us? What does it mean to define ourselves as Christians in the way God sees us, not in the way so often the world judges us by what we've done or not done? Sometimes that may simply mean for us being willing to be people who forgive ourselves. Forgive ourselves for our own messing up and our own failures. Because I know a lot of people who say, I know God forgives me, I'm sure God forgives me, but I just can't get over it. I can't forgive myself. And they keep kicking themselves for that. But if in fact, God doesn't judge us by our successes and failures, why do we keep doing it to ourselves? That's what it means to live as God's beloved child. It means sometimes simply forgiving others. Forgiving others even if they're not the people we think deserve it. Because if God isn't holding failures of others, and that's not what defines those people in God's eyes, who are we to hold grudges? And sometimes living as God's beloved children simply means saying, you know what? The world is in the hands of God who loves us and cares for us, and the fate of the world is determined by God's love, not by whether I'm successful enough in changing it or fixing it. And therefore, I'm able to be free to try to be the light of God in the world without trying to judge myself on how well I succeed or fail. And I can go and do what Luther used to say and sin boldly. I don't know if you remember the phrase from Luther that said sin boldly. In college we used to have them blazoned on t-shirts. Big, big words that said sin boldly. And that was the first part of Luther's quote. And the rest of the quote was really tiny little words under it, but believe in God more boldly still. And Luther said that to people because he kept finding folks who said, I am afraid that if I go out and try to do what God tells me to do, I'm going to mess it up. And then I will fail, and then God will judge me by my failures. And Luther kept saying, you wear your baptism every day. Your baptism is your identity. It's God's love that defines you so that you're able to go out and try to share God's love. And if, in fact, it's God's love that defines you, not your successes and failures, then go and try. Even if it means you're going to end up sinning boldly, you make yourself available to be God's agent in the world. The story of Jesus' ministry begins with the story of his baptism, because in baptism, God gives him an identity. And in our baptisms, God has given us an identity also. Our baptisms tell us that we're God's children, and that we're loved and we're claimed by God, and nothing that we do or don't do ever changes that. And because we're God's children, God has decided to shine his light through us into the midst of the darkness of the world. And here's the great thing about God's light. God's light can shine through both our successes and our failures. So our call as baptized people of God is the same as Jesus. Simply to be those folks who open ourselves to being conduits of God's light and God's love in the world, so that God can work through us to be people who share the light with the darkness